These days, it's become popular to be very critical of capitalism and free enterprise in some circles. But the polarized debate over our economic system is actually harming our ability to advance a principled and pragmatic approach to economic opportunity.
People know what's best for themselves most of the time. Are there instances where that system doesn't quite work and there's need for government to intervene? Of course. But for the vast majority of decisions and economic transactions that happen, individuals are experts on themselves.
The issue is actually more complex than simply a capitalism versus socialism polarized framing. And on this episode, we're going to equip you with a better way to acknowledge capitalism's shortcomings while also being a firm defender of the free enterprise system. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Thank you for joining us once again for Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and our guest this week is Beth Akers, Senior Fellow at American Enterprise Institute. She's been on the show before. Beth, thanks for coming back.
I'm so glad to be here, Nick. Thank you.
So before we get into the details, I want to announce something very exciting for our listeners. Beth is going to be making regular contributions with us in the form of a monthly feature that's going to be all about defending enterprise as part of this podcast. So we're excited to have this conversation and have many, many more in the coming months.
Thank you. I'm so excited too. I think we're going to have a blast and learn a lot.
So as we get into the issue today, to kind of tee off this ongoing contribution you'll be making, we want to talk about free enterprise and capitalism, but acknowledge how polarized the debate has become, like most of our national debates have. And I want to start off by reading a couple of results from a poll from the Pew Foundation from September of 2022, asking folks about capitalism versus socialism. And they said that 36% of U.S. adults say they view socialism somewhat or very positively. So it's a minority, but still 36% of Americans saying, I kind of like socialism. A majority of the public, 57%, continues to view capitalism favorably, and that is 8 percentage points lower than in 2019. And so I start with those to ask, number one, do any of those numbers concern you? And then maybe what does that tell you about the state of how Americans view our economic system today?
I'm not too concerned about those numbers. I think that what it tells us is that we have this false binary in our thinking about these issues. We have framed this as an either or proposition, and that's really not at all an accurate characterization of where we are today. If you think about our system of political economy, what we have is really a mix-up of some aspects of market-based capitalism and free enterprise, and then other instances and segments of our political economy where we have heavy government at state, federal, local level intervention. And so when we talk about these things, it makes a lot more sense to go issue by issue and think on a spectrum that your system of political economy could be tilted more towards a socialized way of organizing your systems or towards a market-based way, a way that embraces more aspects of market forces determining the outcomes of any industry or segment of your political system. So I think we need to have a much more nuanced conversation before we can really get a sense of what people are thinking about and offer it to them in that way, because I think we're falsely trying to capture something here about people's politics rather than the way that they think about issues.
So Beth, one of the things I want to ask is with those numbers and talking about this idea that, well, we're getting the debate wrong, essentially. It's too polarized. When we say capitalism versus socialism, that's probably the wrong framing. Why do you think that is? Is it just endemic of the fact that our country is polarized politically? So of course, this is just going to be another issue where people kind of pick their side and rally to it. Or is it something deeper in terms of the definitions we ascribe to these terms? Do we need to do a better job of saying, well, when I say capitalism, here's what I mean. When I say free enterprise, here's what I mean. Is it just polarization? Is it just we're using terms inaccurately, or is it maybe a combination of both?
Well, I think there are real differences between people who would identify as more of a capitalist versus somebody who would identify more as a socialist. But I think the differences are not that I'm in this camp and you're in this camp and we're totally different. I like to think about it more as a spectrum. So somebody who identifies as a capitalist or someone who would be apt to defend free enterprise, I think of that as a person who tends to put more faith on the forces of the market to get us to good outcomes that require less intervention from the government. Maybe somebody who's more on the end of thinking of themselves as a socialist might be a bit more skeptical of that system and think that in the end, the outcomes that a market-based system would get us to are actually pretty far from what they think of as the optimal. So there are real differences, but I think we should think of these things in terms of the direction that they pull us away from the status quo rather than as like a kind of binary identity. And we're in a place right now where political identity, sexual identity, lots of identity things are, seem very important. And I think that we would probably do better to get away from identifying ideology in this way, but rather think of this as a spectrum of ideology. And that when we tackle any specific policy issue, we want to think about where on that spectrum makes sense for tackling the challenges that we're facing and also achieving the goals that we collectively have.
So essentially, if we want to encourage folks to say, okay, don't just pick a term that you use to sort of champion, I'm on this team, I'm on team capitalism, or I'm on team anti-capitalism.
Yeah.
We need to have a more thoughtful conversation about it. And I think part of that means acknowledging that there are very real feelings of frustration today. Of course, that's embedded in our politics, a number of different issues, but in particular in economic frustration. And I've heard others make the comparison to where we are today economically with inflation, with other aspects of the economy, with kind of this feeling of malaise, to use a term from the 70s. Do you think that there is some of that today that might explain why there is this debate over whether is our system really working, and that then polarizing people into their camp, some saying it's working phenomenally, and others say, well, no, it's not working for me. It is, before we just dismiss, well, critics of capitalism, free enterprise are just getting it wrong, even if they are getting it wrong, are there some real sentiments that are worth acknowledging the way people are feeling that might lead them to arrive at these kinds of conclusions?
I tend to think the popularity of this debate today has more to do with the polarized political environment than it does being a response to any real fundamental differences in our economic situation today relative to a decade or two ago. But I think there are real things that people are thinking about when they are looking at the trade-offs between more socialized systems versus more free enterprise, capitalist-based systems. And I think a popular one is that people will see, look, if we were to yield to an entirely free enterprise system, there are people who are left behind. And I think that even a responsible defender of free enterprise should say, yield, yes, that's the truth. And we don't necessarily want to live in a society where that's the case. And so there is always going to be a role in some instances for government intervention. The fact that pure capitalism, that this kind of anarchist, everyone, Hunger Games style system doesn't solve every problem perfectly is not a reason to reject capitalism, to try to quelch free enterprise. We shouldn't reject everything because that as a pure system fails to solve all of our problems perfectly. But instead, I think we want to embrace that system is basically acknowledging a lot of human nature. And so we can acknowledge that exists and also acknowledge when that gets us short of where we want to be socially, and then justify a government intervention. So again, it comes kind of back to this idea of this is not a binary. And it's the case that neither endpoint of that spectrum is going to offer us all of the things that we want as a society. Individuals will end up at different points along that ideological spectrum in terms of what they think is the right approach. But that's where the meaty debate is. And those are the sorts of conversations that we're going to be having on defending enterprise.
You're touching on something that I think is relevant to a lot of people, because going back to what we said earlier, what do we mean when we say this word? And for me personally, I've felt myself gravitating more towards the term free enterprise, because when I talk about it, I want to center it on you as an individual. You own your labor, you own your skills, you own your time. You get to decide what you do vocationally that's the first most fundamental part of a free enterprise system. But then the system ought to support you being able to pursue a variety of different vocational pursuits that can bring meaning to you and others and provide for a family. And so to me, that's kind of where I gravitate definitionally.
Yeah.
And I want to get into some of the market failures and market successes. But before we do that, maybe ask you to just give an overview to our listeners of when we use the term free enterprise or capitalism, whatever term makes the most sense, what is it that we are defending? And it strikes me that there are a couple components. There's kind of the philosophical component. There's also a pragmatic benefit.
Yeah.
So can you help us understand those two pillars of why free enterprise as maybe an orientation, a sensibility is worth being drawn toward in general?
Right. So that's a really nice framing of it. I think that, in fact, there are sort of two distinct rationales. As you put it, the philosophical component and maybe a more pragmatic. The philosophical, to me, is about freedom. A fundamental part of what America is that we celebrate, embrace, and defend freedom. The notion of free enterprise, that you can do what you wish and follow your own self-interest, build capital, and do what you wish with that. And that those are your resources to use. That's very fundamental to American thinking and critical that we defend. The other piece of it is a bit more academic or pragmatic, and that's that the system of a marketplace very often will get us to better outcomes than we could achieve through a top-down like government management of systems. And I think part of that is recognizing that what happens in a market is individuals or institutions following the incentives that are in place in front of them. We believe that people will tend to do that. And so if we build a system around the assumption that people are behaving self-interested, even though that may feel a bit unsavory sometimes, very often that will get us to a good outcome. And so it's embracing this notion that market forces exist, that people are self-interested, that human nature cannot be squelched in any way, and then building off of that to work towards achieving the desirable goals that we have.
I want to get into more detail of that idea of human nature, because it relates to some of the previous episodes where we're talking about the foundational structure of our country, the form of government that we have, and in this case, the institution, as well as the principle of a free enterprise system, that it's built to recognize the realities of human nature and accommodate that. And we'll get into some details of how that can, as you said, create some circumstances that might feel unsavory. And so we'll talk about market failures, market successes, and maybe some areas where there could be some refinement. We need to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Beth Akers to talk more about these details of a free enterprise system and capitalism and how to approach it in a principled, pragmatic way. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas, a podcast dedicated to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and we've been talking with Beth Akers about free enterprise and capitalism and how to have a pragmatic and principled approach to this very important issue. But before we continue, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to this podcast on any of the major platforms, wherever you like to get your shows. You can also find short clips that you can share on social media and use in your conversations with friends and family. That's defendingideas.org. Beth, I want to continue where we left off and frame the question in this way. First of all, you've had an illustrious career in different capacities working in these issues. You're not just sitting here sort of on the sidelines commenting. You've had real experience in issues of markets and enterprise and capitalism and government. What in your professional life has informed, you to say, well, I defend and support free enterprise in a principled, pragmatic way?
Yeah, good question. So I'm probably more of a defender of free enterprise today than I have been at any other point in my career. And I'll tell you, a big transition point in my thinking on this issue actually came from my experience working in government, which was pretty early in my career. I had the opportunity to work as a young economist in the Bush administration, what should have been a boring period of time, but turned out to be the beginning of the mortgage-induced financial crisis. So I was kind of on the front lines of dealing with some really urgent, pressing policy needs. Before coming into government, I always imagined the folks who were running our nation and our economy were kind of these superheroes who had infinite knowledge and ability to manage these scenarios. And then I found, oh, wait, now it's actually me. I am human and infallible, and I had things that I wasn't sure about. I found that it felt like, to a degree, we were flying by the seat of our pants and trying to solve the problems that we were working on at that time. And that's not to say I think we did a bad job. I think we did a pretty good job. But it was a really great reminder that putting all of the decisions and the authority into the hands of people or the government is really just putting the authority into the hands of people who can make mistakes and don't have infinite knowledge. And so that drove me more into the place of thinking, to the extent that the market can solve problems, can allocate resources efficiently, can create an organized system that functions well, we should let that happen. And then there will be instances where the government and people like me who are in policymaking positions need to step in and manage things. But we want to minimize that and make sure that we're using that limited resource of brain power and expertise and knowledge to solve the problems where it's critically needed, rather than trying to oversee systems that, absent intervention, could manage themselves.
It sounds like what you're saying is a good practical example of the two-part framing you offered in our previous segment, that the merits of a free enterprise capitalist system are it makes freedom possible, and also it maybe more often than not, hopefully a lot of the time, has outcomes from market-based forces that are desirable, that we would all support and like. And that was a real-life experience of that, where not only is seeing things from the government side and realizing, well, equipping people with the ability to be decision makers in their own lives as it relates to the economy is a good thing philosophically, and it leads to better outcomes.
Right. Because if you want all the power in the hands of the government, you are sort of saying that you think the government knows better than individuals. And I tend to think that people know what's best for themselves most of the time. Are there instances where that system doesn't quite work and there's need for government to intervene? Of course. But for the vast majority of decisions and economic transactions that happen, individuals are experts on themselves. And so believing in the market and not having an oppressive government intervention in any sort of space allows people to make decisions for themselves, allows them to operate in a way that follows their own self-interest. And I use the word self-interest instead of selfishness. That's something economists tend to do. And it's to emphasize that it's not unsavory for people to do what is good for them. We need people to do what's good for themselves, because the government can't necessarily oversee every decision or transaction in your life. So best first to rely on a system where individuals are driving their day-to-day decisions. And then when that falls short of getting us to where we need to be, then bring in the government and use the limited resource of government knowledge, expertise, and ability to solve very specific problems.
I think there's a way to articulate a principle that you're getting at, that very often capitalism is critiqued as being, well, it's based in greed or selfishness. Yep. But perhaps a better framing is, if I want to go out and make money as a capitalist in the free enterprise system, I will make $0 unless whatever I'm creating in the form of a good or a service is valuable to someone else. Right. So someone else has to say, hey, what you're doing really helps me out. It helps me out so much, I'm willing to give you money for that good or service. So it seems to me that it's a totally different framing of the capitalism and free enterprise system. And that's really important to equip our listeners with, that it's, yes, it's self-interested, but in a positive way, because your self-interest is benefiting other people, because your widget you're creating, if nobody wants it, you're going to fail.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great point. And the notion of corporate greed has been the really popular talking point in politics recently. And I like to point out that corporate greed is the reason that I have an iPhone in my pocket that's more powerful than a block-sized computer was a generation ago. We all benefit from the innovation that's driven by greed or self-interest. The fact that there are billions to be earned for an entrepreneur who comes up with a new technology that benefits everyone, makes everyone's lives better, that's actually not a bad thing. I'm okay with someone becoming a billionaire because they're creating something that's of such great value to so many people that we're willing to throw our money at them. That makes all of our lives better.
This is a great example of resounding market successes. And there are tons of options we could point to just to add on to that. I mean, during the pandemic, when so many Americans were not leaving their home in many environments, being able to order things from Amazon, have it arrive at your doorstep. Grocery pickup is a service that's evolved since then. Curbside pickup for restaurants. I mean, in fact, I joked with my wife, within the last year or so, when Jeff Bezos went to space, and joked that, hey, well, because of the value he's created, and we had ordered something from Amazon that showed up the next morning that was something we needed by a certain timeline, said, he can go to space as much as he wants if they're creating this kind of value in the marketplace. And that's maybe a trivial way to put it. But these mechanisms that we all partake in, that you've mentioned the iPhone and the smartphone and modern technology is probably one of the greatest advancements. What are some other ways that people ought to think about the market as having resounding successes that's benefited us?
Well, Nick, I want to point out too, you offer that that's a trivial example, the fact that you can have a product that you need delivered the very next day without leaving your home. But when you think about the advances of technology, our lives are full of just stockpiles of these trivial advantages, things that on the whole make our life dramatically better. So I don't want to minimize the success of especially technological innovation in making our lives better. And some critics of capitalism or defending free enterprise might say, well, is it really fair that Bezos has these billions that he can take to fly off to the moon or what have you, whereas I get nothing? And I think that's really a improper framing, because we need to think about the increases in the standard of living that we all have. It's not that our wages are necessarily higher. It's not that we're necessarily getting, a check from Bezos for our contribution to his success, but it's that we all benefit from that innovation. And I think that's the sort of advantage that we want to think about. The existence of free enterprise creates a bigger pie that can be divided amongst all of us if we so choose, but also that we directly benefit from the innovation, whether it be in medicine, technology, or any other space. Our lives are immeasurably better today. And I say immeasurably because there aren't numbers behind how much easier it makes your life to be able to get that product delivered from Amazon the next morning.
Another example that comes to mind in previous work, I worked with businesses and in the nonprofit sector, and in particular, there was a business that donated money, and this happens often, donated money specifically to fund food pantries in part of the West Valley area here in the Salt Lake area. And they were able to do that because they had been successful as a business in the private sector, in a free enterprise capitalist system, because they were able to generate profits and, of course, pay their employees and provide a valuable service to the community just in their business. Then being able to say, we also want to and are able to give to causes that are worthwhile because we have benefited from the profit motive in the system. And so I think that's something that people often forget, is that charitable donations, contributions from obviously businesses to causes like that, from individuals to local churches that then engage in local philanthropic efforts. The fact that any of us, individuals or businesses, have extra dollars that we don't need just to keep ourselves and our family alive means we can then give those dollars to good causes is a resounding win of the free enterprise system.
Absolutely. So I'd say generally the accumulation of wealth that we've had in this nation, we can thank capitalism and free enterprise for. Absent that, I mean, you can critique capitalism, but for the most part, we have a free enterprise system that has allowed for the growth that the United States has experienced and the wealth that we enjoy and celebrate today. So yes, I mean, I think that's a great point that you offered. You know, we think about whether the deficiencies of capitalism, and it's that some are left behind, right? We don't necessarily want to embrace that as a final outcome. Part of the solution might be that the government steps in to offer a safety net to people to make sure that no one is left behind by the system. But alternatively, there are private solutions that endorsing free enterprise allows to take place as well. And that's through private philanthropic activity that may support safety nets that offset some of the need for the government to intervene and to provide solutions for people.
I want to get into more detail with things like the safety net and other examples of where I think there is broad agreement among folks right and left that there is an important role for government, and then also get into some of the areas where there's some debate and worthy of debate. We're going to take a quick break and then come back to diving into some of those issues with our guest, Beth Akers, Senior Fellow, American Enterprise Institute. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and our guest this week is Beth Akers, a senior fellow with American Enterprise Institute. We've been talking about free enterprise and capitalism and how to equip all of you with the ability to be a better defender of our economic system that's generated so much opportunity and upward mobility. We also want to talk about some of the shortcomings. Before we get into that, I want to mention two quick things. Number one, Beth is going to be making regular contributions to this podcast moving forward in the form of monthly features that are all about defending enterprise. So this discussion today is sort of teeing up some of those ongoing segments we'll have in the coming months, and excited to share those with you as they are produced. I also want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find clips that you can use in conversations with your friends and family. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the major podcast platforms, wherever you like to get your shows. That's defendingideas.org. Beth, I want to continue with this theme of free enterprise capitalism is really great. It's done a lot of good for our society, for the West and the world in general, but it's not perfect. Yeah. And I think to be a clear-eyed defender of a free enterprise capitalist system, we need to acknowledge the shortcomings and be realistic about that. Doesn't mean we cast out the whole system, and also talk about where we can make some improvements. Right. So I want to ask you about what are some examples of either market failures or the kinds of things that we would say there's broad agreement that, yes, this is an example of an area where the market is probably not as well suited to solving the issue, and the government plays a role. So let's start there. Yeah. Where would a pro-capitalist free enterprise person say, actually, here's where we do need government involvement?
Yeah. Well, in academic jargon, an economist might refer to these instances as places where there is a market failure. That's where the characteristics of the industry or the space that we're talking about are just such that leaving the market to itself, you're not going to get to an outcome that's socially desirable. And so there are places where this is really broadly accepted. You have to be pretty far into the pro-capitalist realm before you're going to reject these ideas. Things like military being part of public service rather than something that we individually employ through marketplace. Local emergency responders, right? Police, fire. I don't necessarily want people signing up for a fireman subscription service where they have to rely on that in order to get help if their house is burning down. So infrastructure, roads, bridges, things like that, they tend to work better. And there are economic rationale and stories as to why these markets fail to provide what we'd want. But I think it's probably enough for our purposes to say that, these are places where even pretty diehard defenders of capitalism are going to say there's room for government to intervene here, and we'll probably better for it.
I want to pinpoint something that relates back to our earlier conversation about polarization and how things might sound good on the campaign trail or in political rhetoric, but are not actually true when you look at the issues on the ground. And something I've heard from times is people who are very, very critical of the government saying things like, well, the government ruins everything it touches. Yeah. And it sounds like we're saying, well, no, there are some things that the government should do, and some instances where it does it well. Yeah. That doesn't mean it should do all things, which is where the market comes in.
Yeah. And I mean, that's where people are going to disagree, right? Sure, there are people who think we should have sort of an anarchist style of existence where the government does nothing for us. It's a Hunger Games style life, or, there are no roads. Maybe we work together and a company offers a road and we pay a toll. I mean, that's probably not the world that I want to live in, but maybe some others do. But then you get farther into the spectrum, which is something like, I don't want my neighbor to not have access to healthcare, for example. If my neighbor is diagnosed with cancer, I want there to be an alternative for them if they don't have privately sponsored health insurance through their employer or through the private marketplace. I want there to be an option for them. Other conservatives or pro-capitalists might not feel that way. And that's kind of as we get into the gray area, when we think about these different policy arenas, where do you fall in the spectrum of what's an appropriate level of intervention? And are you satisfied with what the market would provide? And so that's a nuanced conversation. There's probably not a right answer. I'm going to probably try to convince people that they should come more towards the free market solution than they might otherwise, but others could feel differently.
That example, I think, tied into higher ed, which you've done a ton of work on over the years, have a tremendous amount of expertise there where, if you think of advanced education and healthcare as two examples of industries that are very important. Education can be a tremendous engine for upward mobility. Healthcare obviously can address sometimes our worst days if we deal with medical issues or things that are routine but also expensive. And my wife and I had a baby recently and things like that where there are costs associated with that. And so they're two very, very important sectors for a variety of reasons. Is this an example where, as you mentioned, there's kind of a debate? There are some who say, well, we need more government intervention. And it sounds like you're saying we actually need more market forces, but there still maybe is a role for government involvement in sectors like this because they're so important and complicated. But if we can inject a little bit more of a market enterprise sensibility into these industries, even while government still plays albeit maybe restrained role, that's a better way to approach the issues.
Yeah, I think a recognition of market forces, even when things are done through government programs, can actually create lots of improvements. And an example I'll talk about is with federal student lending, which is obviously a hot political topic today. We hear a lot about how federal student loans aren't working. They're unaffordable. Students aren't able to repay them. Taxpayers aren't getting repaid the amount that they're due. Interestingly, we don't hear a lot about the private student loan market, in part because it's pretty small. But I will offer that it actually works pretty well. People are taking on loans that are affordable. Lenders are getting repaid. Default rates are low. For the most part, the fact that this segment has allowed market forces to set prices, to set availability of credit, has made it work. And the fact that we've departed entirely from that sort of market-based price setting and availability of credit in the lending program is a part of what's gotten us to the problematic place that we're in. So I don't think that we should pull the federal government entirely out of federal student lending, maybe on some margins, but not entirely. But I certainly think that we could bring some of the pricing components in from the idea of a private marketplace that would make the federal program function a lot better. So that's a great example. I mean, even Milton Friedman wrote in the 1950s that we need federal intervention in student lending for higher education. So, a pretty staunch defender of capitalism, acknowledging the need in this space. But the more that we can recognize market forces and harness them to our advantage within government programs, the better off we're going to be.
I think another one that in general has broad resonance is the idea of a social safety net. Even, again, acknowledging there are many, many ways to improve the social safety net, our various public assistance programs. But acknowledging that in many ways, the safety net is a positive sort of capstone of a free enterprise capitalist system, because our system generates enough wealth that we as a society have enough resources to put towards helping those who are struggling, is a manifestation of the success of the system, not an indictment of it being a failure.
Right.
Does that seem like a framing that can help people who want to defend free enterprise still have an area where they say, well, here's a really good example of where there is a role for government?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is where the illustration of the pie works well. So if you think this is a zero-sum game, you might not be in the business of thinking that capitalism is a great idea, because you may not like the distribution of gains, right? The fact that some people benefit a lot, some people benefit a little, some people are kind of totally left behind. But if you appreciate that capitalism allows the innovation that makes the pie bigger, so there's more pie to go around, and that part of government's role is to redistribute. And of course, we're going to disagree about how it should be redistributed, but we can't disagree about the fact that if you allow innovation, the pie is getting bigger. And then we take that bigger pie, and then we can think about who needs help and who doesn't. But let's let the pie get bigger. And that's what embracing free enterprise allows us to do.
In our brief time left, I want to touch on a couple of things that are usually kind of lobbed as critiques of capitalism for enterprise, saying, well, the system is flawed or immoral for these reasons. And two that I think are worth talking about are minimum wage and then price gouging before natural disasters. So can you talk about those, help our folks understand why are those arguments in the context of whether capitalism is good or bad, and how should we be thinking about those two issues?
Yeah, so those are great examples. So minimum wage was really politically important in the past few years, less so since post-COVID times. But we were talking a lot about raising minimum wage to $15. Bernie Sanders was a big champion of that idea. What's less spoken about is the trade-off that's inherent in that. So requiring employers to pay a $15 minimum wage may mean that there are no longer the jobs that previously were paying less than that. So we'd like to imagine that it just means that every job that exists today has a higher wage. That would be great. The reality is that there will be fewer jobs. The jobs that are not worth $15 an hour to an employer will cease to exist anymore. And while the people who go on to get $15 an hour are going to be beneficiaries of the policy, the people who don't have jobs because employers cut the jobs in response to that required $15 minimum wage, those people are worse off. And so that's a question. That's a trade-off. What's the appropriate level? I mean, it's not, a home run either way. We got to think about the trade-offs. I think the price gouging one is a really kind of fun one for economists to look at. Whenever a natural disaster comes along, we have instances of people coming in and selling generators off the backs of their pickup trucks and maybe charging 5 times retail price. And we think, oh gosh, what an evil person, or, and what an unsavory practice. Economists tend to offer that, in fact, that may be a superior system to one in which we demand that prices be held constant. And just to give an example, suppose we had a long-term outage here in Salt Lake City where I live with my family. I don't want generators to be priced at what they are today, because that means I might go out and buy a generator to keep my family of 4 comfortable in our home. I would much prefer that get allocated to a large institution that is accommodating lots of people, maybe a hospital or a group home, someplace where it has greater value. And so giving it a higher price during a time of national disaster or natural disaster actually does that. And so it's a mechanism that feels a little icky at times, and I'll concede that point. It might feel a little icky, but actually it might get us to a better allocation of resources than we'd get if the government were to intervene.
I think as we begin to wrap up, there's a core principle that our listeners can latch onto, and that is something that today happens in the context of a market. That maybe your gut reaction is say, well, that doesn't make sense to me, or I don't agree with that, or that seems unfair. If we dig a little deeper into, okay, what does that actually mean practically for people on the ground? And these last 2 examples where minimum wage, the idea of giving, I think it was President Obama who said America deserves a raise. So the rhetoric around it maybe feels good, but when you think about it, say, well, other people are going to lose their jobs. Yeah. When you think about it in practice, it changes it. And same with this idea of elevated prices before natural disasters. So how do you wrap that into sort of a generalized principle that our listeners can apply to other things they might encounter or criticisms of the free enterprise system people might lob. Say, well, actually, if you apply this principle, dig deeper, figure out what the practical impact on the ground is going to be, how would you articulate that to someone in a way that they can say, this is my North Star when evaluating these kinds of debates?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think a lot of it comes down to having to acknowledge that trade-offs exist. And, for example, my area of expertise, deep expertise, is on higher education. And a lot of times we were talking about canceling student loans, making college free. And you think well, yeah, of course people would be better off if college were free or if we canceled student loans, except somebody's actually going to pay for that. And that's the trade-off. And is that worth what you get from the policy, the initial policy action? Basically, are the secondary effects of the policy justified for the gain that you get? So trade-offs. The emphasis is on trade-offs. Oftentimes when we're arguing for a government intervention, there is absence of discussion about what is going to be lost as a secondary effect. And so I think trade-offs is a nice way of capturing that.
Trade-offs and people respond to incentives. My former years ago public finance teacher would appreciate that I mentioned that as well.
I'd be a poor economist if I didn't say both of those things.
Exactly. Well, Beth, we want to thank you so much for being with us today, and very excited about your ongoing monthly contributions to help us become better defenders of free enterprise in the principled and pragmatic way that you've outlined today. So thank you so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you. We're going to have a blast.
Well, we're going to take a final break before we leave you with some final words. Thanks for joining us here on Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before you go, just a couple final thoughts. If you find yourself in a conversation with somebody who's being very critical of capitalism or free enterprise, here are a few things you can consider sharing in that discussion. Number one, articulate the fact that free enterprise has lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty, not just here in the United States, but also around the world. And recognize that it has improved all of our lives in immeasurable ways through technological innovation, rising standards of living, and a number of other factors that are hard to measure, but things that we see every day. Number two, acknowledge its shortcomings. Be honest about the fact that you care about things like poverty, you care about things like public infrastructure, and that there is a role for government to be involved in a number of areas like that, even if in many instances it might need to be restrained or refined in some very important ways. Third, see if you can enlist some shared support and at least the concept of a free enterprise approach that tries to improve and enhance personal freedom in this country, and also one that is situated to leading to, in general, better outcomes most of the time on a range of issues. Lastly, I want to remind you that Beth Akers will be making regular appearances on Defending Ideas in the form of a monthly feature called Defending Enterprise. So you'll get a lot more of what you heard today in more depth and detail, talking about a range of issues to help you to be a better principled and pragmatic defender of our free enterprise system and helping to improve it for all of us so we can have greater opportunity for Americans. That's it for today. We hope you feel better equipped to be a defender of the ideas you heard about today. If you like what you heard, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find clips that you can share in your conversations on social media and with friends and family. You can also subscribe to this podcast on any of the major platforms wherever you like to get our shows. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nick Dunn. We'll see you next time.